You are about to hear a name that was never meant to reach the public. Operation Immaculate Constellation. Not in official press releases, not in declassified summaries, not even in the usual conspiracy circles. Because if this operation is real, then everything we think we know about unidentified objects in our skies is incomplete, and maybe intentionally incomplete. This isn't a story that begins with a sighting. It begins with a pattern buried inside decades of reports, ignored by most, dismissed by many, but quietly studied by a very small number of people who were never supposed to talk. Because once you see the pattern, you stop asking, "What was that?" And you start asking a far more dangerous question. Why are they tracking it? Not reporting, not investigating, tracking. There's a difference. And that difference is where this story starts to get uncomfortable. Over the years, thousands of sightings have been logged. Pilots, military personnel, radar operators, different locations, different decades, different witnesses. But in some of those cases, the response wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Objects appearing and being treated as if they were expected. Not identified, not explained. Expected. Let that sit for a second. Because if something unknown is being expected, then it isn't completely unknown. And that's where the first crack appears. You don't build tracking systems for things that surprise you. You build them for things that return. Again, and again, and again. Which brings us to something that doesn't show up in headlines. Not a craft, not a sighting, not even a single event. A system. A quiet, layered system that doesn't react to anomalies. It catalogs them. Patterns of movement, recurring locations, time windows, flight behaviors. Not random, structured. And the people involved in that system weren't chasing mysteries. They were monitoring them. That's a very different mindset. Because monitoring assumes something critical. You already know enough to keep watching, but not enough to stop it. And that's where the name starts to surface. Not publicly, not cleanly, but in fragments. Internal references, leaked mentions, secondhand confirmations from people who don't agree on everything, except this. The name exists. Operation Immaculate Constellation. And if that sounds dramatic, it should. Because the name itself tells you something. Constellation. Not one object. Many. Connected. Mapped. Immaculate. Clean. Precise. Controlled. That combination doesn't describe chaos. It describes organization. Which raises a question most people never think to ask. What if the unknown isn't random? What if it's being observed because it behaves in ways that can be predicted? And what happens when something unpredictable starts becoming predictable? You don't panic. You prepare. And that's exactly what some insiders suggest happened. Quietly. Over years. Without headlines. Without announcements. Without public discussion. Because once something like this becomes public, you can't control how people react. And control seems to be a recurring theme in this story. Not control of the objects, control of the information. Who knows? Who speaks? What gets released? And more importantly, what doesn't? Because here's where things shift. This isn't just about sightings anymore. It's about access. Who had access to the data? Who could see the patterns? Who could connect the dots? And who was deliberately kept out of it? Because if Operation Immaculate Constellation is real, then this isn't a mystery being solved. It's a reality being managed. And the public was never part of that management. Which brings us to the next problem. If something has been tracked for years, if patterns exist, if systems were built around it, then the question is no longer, are these objects real? The question becomes, how long have they known? And that's where this story stops being theoretical. Because the timeline doesn't start recently. It goes back further than most people expect. Far enough back that it overlaps with programs that were never supposed to be connected. Programs that, on the surface, had nothing to do with unidentified objects. But beneath that surface, shared something very specific. Data. And in part 2, we look at where that data may have come from, and why some of the earliest signals were never meant to be seen. Before anything was tracked, it had to be detected. And that's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because detection systems don't get built overnight. They evolve. Quietly, gradually, over years. Most people assume sightings come first and systems come later. But what if it happened the other way around? What if something was already being picked up before anyone even understood what they were looking at? Long before the term UFO became mainstream, there were signals. Not visual, not eyewitness accounts. Signals. Anomalies in radar returns. Objects appearing where nothing should exist, then vanishing without a trace. No debris, no consistent trajectory, no known explanation. At first, these were treated as errors, faulty readings, atmospheric interference, equipment glitches, because that's the easiest explanation. And for a while, it worked. Until the same errors started repeating. Same altitudes, same movement patterns, same sudden disappearances, different locations, different operators, different systems, same behavior. At that point, it stops being an error. It becomes a problem. Because radar doesn't imagine things. It records reflections, which means something was there. Not once, repeatedly. And that's when the shift begins. Quietly, without public acknowledgement, certain anomalies stop being dismissed and start being flagged. Not for explanation, for tracking. That word again, tracking, which means someone made a decision, not to solve it, but to follow it. And that decision changes everything. Because once you start tracking something, you start building systems around it. Dedicated filters, priority flags, restricted access logs. Not everyone sees everything. Only selected personnel, compartmentalized, controlled. And that's where the second layer appears. Data doesn't stay in one place. It moves. From radar operators to analysts, from analysts to classified channels, from classified channels to programs that officially don't exist. Because here's what most people don't realize. Some of the earliest advanced tracking capabilities weren't designed for aircraft. They were designed for threats, unknown threats. And when something behaves like a threat, even if it doesn't act like one, it gets attention. Not public attention, internal attention, which is far more serious. Because internal attention doesn't ask, "What is this?" It asks, "Do we understand it enough to predict it?" And that question leads directly into systems that don't just observe, they correlate. Time, location, speed, reappearance. Patterns start to form. Not obvious at first, but enough to raise concern. Because when something appears random and then slowly starts showing consistency, it stops being random. And that's where things begin to overlap. Different programs, different departments, different objectives, but one shared element, the same anomalies, which should not happen. Because if multiple independent systems are picking up the same unknowns, then those unknowns are not isolated incidents. They're part of something larger. And larger systems don't stay hidden forever, unless someone makes sure they do. And that's where suppression enters the story. Not aggressive, not obvious, subtle. Information gets redirected. Reports get reclassified. Certain cases never move beyond internal review. No announcement, no denial, just silence. Because silence is easier to manage than explanation. and explanation leads to questions. Questions lead to attention. Attention leads to loss of control. And control, again, matters here. Because by now, this isn't just about detection anymore. It's about ownership of information. Who controls the data controls the narrative. And if Operation Immaculate Constellation exists, then its foundation isn't sightings. It's data aggregation. Decades of it, collected quietly, organized carefully, shared selectively. Because once patterns become clear enough, they don't stay inside one report. They become something else. A map. Not a physical map, a behavioral map. Where these objects appear, when they appear, how they move, and most importantly, how often they come back. Because repetition changes everything. One sighting is a mystery. Repeated sightings become a system. And systems can be studied, predicted, anticipated. Which leads to a question that almost no one asks. If they knew where to look, were they ever just observing? Or were they waiting? Because waiting implies expectation, and expectation implies prior knowledge. And prior knowledge means this didn't start when we noticed it. It started when we began to understand it. And that point may be much earlier than anyone wants to admit. Because in Part 3, we step into the people who had access to this data, the ones who saw the patterns firsthand, and why some of them chose to break silence. At some point, data stops being just data. It starts belonging to people, specific people, people who have access others don't, people who see patterns others never will, people who are told just enough and then told to stop asking. Because inside any restricted system, there's always a line. You can analyze, you can report, you can log, but you don't question the system itself. And the moment someone does, they become a problem. This is where Operation Immaculate Constellation shifts from theory to something more uncomfortable. Because it's not just about what was being tracked, it's about who was watching. Over time, fragments began to surface. Not official statements, not press conferences. Fragments. Accounts from individuals who were never meant to speak publicly. Different roles, different backgrounds, but a shared experience. They saw more than they were supposed to understand. And that creates pressure. Because when you're inside a system built on controlled information, you don't see the full picture. You see pieces, but sometimes pieces overlap. And when they do, you start noticing gaps. Gaps between what's recorded and what's explained, between what's observed and what's acknowledged. That gap is where doubt begins. And doubt, inside a classified environment, is dangerous. Because doubt leads to questions, and questions lead to attention. Not public attention, internal attention. The kind that doesn't make headlines. The kind that makes people reconsider what they say and who they say it to. Some of those insiders describe the same feeling. Not fear of the objects, fear of the system. Because the system didn't react to the unknown, it reacted to curiosity. That distinction matters. If the unknown was the real threat, you'd expect urgency, open investigation, broad analysis. Instead, there was containment. Information stayed inside, conversations stayed limited, and certain discussions simply didn't happen. Not because they couldn't, because they weren't allowed to. And that's where the first real fractures appear. Because humans don't operate well inside unanswered questions, especially when those questions involve things they've personally seen or personally analyzed. Over time, a few individuals begin to step outside that boundary. Carefully, indirectly. They don't release everything. They can't. but they confirm something critical. The pattern exists, the tracking exists, and the operation name is not fictional. That alone changes the landscape, because now it's no longer just speculation, it's partial confirmation. And partial confirmation is dangerous, because it doesn't answer questions, it multiplies them. If the operation exists, who authorized it? If tracking exists, what exactly are they tracking? And if insiders are uncomfortable, what do they know that isn't being said? Because here's the part most people miss. When people inside a system break silence, they don't do it for attention. They do it because something doesn't sit right, because something feels unresolved. And unresolved systems don't stay stable forever. Some of those insiders described specific moments. Moments where data didn't match expectations, objects appearing outside predicted windows, behaviors that didn't follow previous patterns. And when patterns break, systems react. Not publicly, internally. More restrictions, more compartmentalization, less visibility, which creates an even bigger problem. Because now, even the people inside the system don't see the same thing anymore. Information becomes fragmented, layered, distributed, so no single person has full clarity. And that's not an accident. That's design. Because when no one has the full picture, no one can fully expose it. But there's a cost to that design. Confusion, inconsistency, and eventually, contradiction. Because when different insiders start speaking, their stories don't always align perfectly. Not because they're lying, because they're seeing different slices of the same system. And that creates friction. Critics point to inconsistencies. Supporters point to overlap. And the truth sits somewhere in between. Which makes this even harder to resolve. Because now you're not just dealing with unknown objects. You're dealing with human interpretation, memory, access levels, personal bias, and controlled information, all layered together. So how do you separate fact from distortion when even the sources don't fully agree? You don't. You look for one thing instead: consistency of pattern. Not in what people say, in what they experienced. And across multiple accounts, one thing remains consistent. Tracking was real. Patterns were real. And the level of interest was far higher than anything publicly acknowledged. That alone forces a shift. Because now the question changes again. It's no longer, is this operation real? It becomes, how much of it are we not seeing? And more importantly, why? Because if information is being controlled this tightly, it's not just about secrecy, it's about impact. What happens if this becomes fully public? What changes? What assumptions break? What systems collapse? Because in part 4, we follow the one thread that explains everything else. Not sightings, not insiders, motivation. Why this would be hidden at all. At some point, every hidden system leads to one question. Not what it is, not how it works, but why it exists. Because systems this controlled don't exist without purpose, and that purpose is rarely simple. By now, we've moved past sightings, past detection, past insiders. We're left with something harder to ignore: intent. Because if Operation Immaculate Constellation is real, it didn't build itself. It was authorized, funded, protected, which means someone believed this was worth hiding. And hiding something at this level comes with a cost: resources, personnel, time. you don't spend that on something insignificant. So what justifies it? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them are comfortable. The first is the simplest: control of narrative. If something exists that can't be easily explained, you don't release it. You manage it. Because once the public starts asking questions you can't answer, you lose authority. And authority, once lost, is hard to regain. So you delay, you classify, you reduce exposure. Not because you're hiding the truth, but because you don't have a stable version of it. That alone is enough reason for secrecy, but it's not the only one. The second possibility is more direct: technology. Not necessarily alien, not necessarily human, but something that behaves outside known capability. If even a fraction of that behavior can be understood, it changes everything. Propulsion, energy systems, movement without visible force. Even partial understanding would redefine entire industries, which makes it valuable, extremely valuable. And valuable things are not shared freely. They're studied, replicated, protected. Because whoever understands it first doesn't just gain knowledge, they gain advantage. And advantage is never released without control. Which leads to the third possibility: not control of information, not control of technology, control of perception. Because if something exists that doesn't fit inside our current understanding, then our understanding has to change. And large-scale shifts in perception don't happen cleanly. They create instability, questions about authority, questions about history, questions about what else hasn't been explained. And once those questions begin, they don't stop. So instead of triggering that shift, you delay it, indefinitely if possible. You keep the system contained, you release fragments, you allow speculation, but never confirmation. Because speculation can be dismissed, confirmation cannot. And that difference is everything. Which brings us back to Operation Immaculate Constellation. If it exists as described, it sits at the center of all three possibilities: information control, technological interest, perception management. And that combination is not accidental. It's strategic. Because when multiple motivations align, systems become harder to break. Not because they're hidden well, because they're protected from multiple angles. Which explains something that's been consistent throughout this entire story. No clear denial, no full confirmation. Just enough ambiguity to keep everything unstable. And instability is useful, because when people aren't sure what to believe, they don't act. They debate, they argue, they doubt. And while that happens, the system continues exactly as it was designed, quietly, unchallenged. But there's a problem with that approach, because over time, patterns don't just stay inside classified systems. They leak. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough. Enough for people to notice. Enough for connections to form. Enough for stories like this to start gaining traction. And once a story reaches that point, it becomes harder to contain. Because now it's not just data, it's attention. And attention spreads faster than information ever could. Which creates pressure. Not internal pressure, external pressure. The kind that forces responses, even if those responses are incomplete. Because silence only works up to a point. And that point may be approaching. Because now we arrive at the final question. Not what is being tracked, not who knows about it, but what happens next. Because systems built on secrecy don't last forever. They either evolve or they get exposed. And in Part 5, we look at what this actually means. Not for the system, for us. Because if even part of this is true, then this isn't just a hidden operation. It's a shift, one we haven't fully noticed yet. By now, you've heard the fragments: patterns, tracking systems, insiders, control, and one name that refuses to sit quietly: Operation Immaculate Constellation. But here's the problem. None of this ends with a clean answer. Because real systems like this don't resolve. They persist, quietly. Which means the real question was never, is it real? It was always, what does it change if it is? Because belief doesn't change reality, but confirmed patterns do. If something has been tracked for years, if systems were built around it, if access was restricted, then one thing becomes unavoidable. This isn't about a single mystery. It's about a sustained observation. And sustained observation only happens for one reason: relevance. You don't watch something for decades unless it matters. And that forces a shift in how we look at all of this. Because most people approach cases like this as isolated events. One sighting, one witness, one unexplained moment. But this isn't that. This is continuity, repeated presence, repeated detection, repeated analysis. And continuity changes the entire frame. Because once something becomes continuous, it stops being rare. It becomes part of the environment, not understood, but present. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because humans are used to unknowns that disappear, things we can dismiss, forget, move past. But this doesn't disappear. It repeats. Which means ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just keeps it outside awareness. And that's been the pattern. Not denial, distance. Keep it far enough away from public understanding so it never becomes a priority. Because once something becomes a priority, it demands answers. And answers are exactly what this situation doesn't provide. Only probabilities. Possibility 1. A system built around misinterpreted data. Patterns that look structured, but are the result of human bias. Possible, but it struggles with consistency. Because bias doesn't repeat cleanly across decades, different systems, different observers. Possibility 2. A controlled narrative built around something explainable, but sensitive. Advanced technology, restricted programs. Something real, but human, that explains secrecy. It explains classification. But it doesn't fully explain behavior. Because even classified technology follows rules. And the patterns described don't always follow those rules. Which leaves the third possibility. Something real. Something not fully understood. Something observed long enough to recognize patterns, but not long enough to control them. And that possibility is the one that changes everything. Because it doesn't offer closure, it offers uncertainty. And uncertainty is something systems try to avoid. Not because it's dangerous, because it's uncontrollable. Which brings us to the final point. Operation Immaculate Constellation, whether fully accurate or partially distorted, represents something bigger than itself. Not proof, not confirmation, but direction. A direction that suggests this. We are not looking at isolated anomalies. We are looking at something being observed, over time, with intent. And when observation reaches that level, it stops being curiosity. It becomes strategy. And strategy always has a reason, even if that reason is never explained. So where does that leave us? Not with answers, with awareness. Because once you understand that patterns may exist, you start seeing things differently. Reports don't feel random anymore. Disappearances don't feel isolated. Silence doesn't feel empty. It feels intentional. And maybe that's the real shift here. Not discovering something new, realizing something has been there longer than we thought. Quietly observed, carefully managed, and never fully explained. Because in the end, this isn't a story about what's in the sky. It's a story about what we choose to see, and what we're never meant to connect. I'm your host for Vantage Elite, and tonight, we didn't solve the mystery. We followed the pattern.